Have you ever sent a direct message that you just instantly regretted?
Oh, man. I think everyone has that one story.
Right. I'm talking about that split second. You hit send and your stomach just drops to the floor
Oh, yeah.
and you realize you just created this huge mess that you absolutely cannot clean up.
Yeah, but usually that just ends with an awkward apology, Or maybe you lose a friend. It
Right.
rarely ends with the collapse of an empire.
Exactly. But that is actually the scale we're working with today. We are looking at what is arguably history's most catastrophic DM.
It really is.
A message that didn't just get leaked. It fundamentally broke the world order of the 20th century. We are doing a deep dive into the Zimmerman telegram today.
Yeah, it's the ultimate case study in how a single piece of paper, or I guess a coded cable in this case, can alter the entire trajectory of a global conflict.
For sure.
It's the butterfly effect in action. But the butterfly is a German diplomat, and the hurricane is American intervention in World War I.
I love that analogy. And to guide us through this, we're looking at an incredible article by Kyle Iorio. It's titled The Zimmerman Telegram, Germany's Fatal Diplomatic Gamble.
That title is perfect.
It is, because gamble is really the operative word here, isn't it?
It was a massive gamble. And to understand why they rolled the dice like that, we really have to look at the board.
Set the stage for us.
Right. So we're in January 1917. And for you listening, you really need to forget what you know about the end of the war and just sit in that specific moment.
Yeah, because looking at the source material, the situation for Germany is just bleak.
Extremely bleak.
The war has been raging since 1914. We aren't talking about fluid, dynamic cavalry movements anymore. We are talking about the trenches.
The worst kind of warfare.
Exactly. A deadly stalemate, as Iorio puts it in the article.
And honestly, stalemate almost sounds too passive. It was a meat grinder. Germany was effectively besieged at this point.
Because of the British Navy, right?
Yeah. Exactly. The British Royal Navy had a complete stranglehold on the North Sea. They were blockading German ports. And the German population was starving, like literally starving.
They called it the turnip winter, right?
Yeah.
In 1916 and 1917?
Yes, because there was literally nothing else to eat. It was dire.
So the German High Command is looking at the math. And the math basically says they are going to lose a war of attrition.
Right. They can't just hold the line forever.
They need a knockout blow, something to break that British supply chain.
Precisely. Which leads to the first major domino falling here. The decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare.
I want to spend a second on this because it's really the engine driving the whole story. Unrestricted sounds technical, but it's actually terrifying in practice.
It is terrifying. It meant the rules of engagement were just gone, tossed out.
Wow.
German U-boats were ordered to sink any ship found in the war zone around the British Isles.
Any ship.
Any ship. Merchant ships, neutral vessels, passenger liners. It didn't matter. If it floated, they were going to sink it.
And this is where the United States comes into the picture. Because up until this point, President Woodrow Wilson is desperately trying to keep the U.S. out of the war.
Desperately.
He literally just won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war."
Right. Wilson was a staunch idealist. He wanted this concept of peace without victory.
But the Germans knew that wouldn't last if they started sinking ships again.
Exactly. They knew that the moment they started sinking American ships, and remember this is after the Lusitania incident years prior, so tensions are already there.
Right.
They knew Wilson would be forced to act.
So their calculation was basically, we're going to start sinking ships on February 1st. That will almost certainly bring the U.S. into the war.
Yeah.
But, and this is a massive, but they thought they could starve Britain into surrendering before the Americans could actually mobilize an army and get it across the Atlantic.
That was the bet. It was a race against time.
A huge risk.
Absolutely. However, Arthur Zimmerman, the German foreign secretary, he decided they needed an insurance policy.
Just in case.
Right, a distraction, something to keep the Americans busy in their own hemisphere so they literally couldn't send troops to Europe.
And enter the bad DM.
Enter the DM.
Zimmerman hatches this unbelievable plan to ally with Mexico. And I have to say, the logistics of this get so fascinating to me. We always focus on what the message actually said,
Yeah.
but the way it was sent is almost more unbelievable.
Oh, this is one of those details that sounds entirely made up. like fiction.
Right.
You have to remember, on the very first day of the war back in 1914, the British ship Telconia actually cut Germany's transatlantic telegraph cables.
So Germany had no direct line to the Americas at all.
Physically cut off, they were blind. So how do you send a top-secret message to your ambassador in Washington and then on to Mexico City?
You would think it's impossible.
Well, Zimmerman pulled off this massive diplomatic coup, or at least he thought he did. He actually persuaded the American government to let him use their cables.
Wait, hold on. He used the American State Department's cables
Yep.
to send a message plotting the invasion of America.
The irony is just suffocating, isn't it?
That is insane.
President Wilson, who is trying so hard to be the peacemaker, allowed German diplomats to send encrypted messages through American channels. He did it in the hopes that they were discussing peace terms with their embassies.
Oh, wow. So he thought he was facilitating peace.
Exactly.
So Zimmerman hands this highly encrypted message to the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. They telegraph it to Copenhagen, then over to London, then across the Atlantic to the U.S. State Department in Washington, and finally the German ambassador picks it up.
It literally traveled right under the Americans' noses.
It did, but it also traveled through London.
Yes, it did.
And that is exactly where Zimmerman's luck ran out. Because while the Americans were acting as unwitting couriers, the British were listening.
Always listening. Which brings us to Room 40.
Room 40, this isn't just a room number. It's basically the birth of modern signals intelligence, right?
It really is.
Yeah, go.
Led by Admiral Blinker Hall. Room 40 was this eclectic mix of linguists, classicists, puzzle solvers.
Not your typical military guys.
Not at all. And they had been intercepting German traffic for years. So when this specific message cable number 0075, which was resent as number 3040, came across their desks, they knew it was important.
Now, the article mentions they cracked it. But I think we need to clarify, it wasn't like in the movies where you type a password and the text magically appears green on a screen.
Oh, no. It was manual labor.
Yeah.
Grueling manual labor.
Right.
The Germans were using a complex codebook system. Essentially, the telegram was just a string of numbers. Each number corresponded to a word or a phrase in a massive physical dictionary.
But Room 40 didn't have the current dictionary, did they?
They didn't. They had a partially reconstructed version of an older codebook.
Wow.
So imagine trying to solve a cryptogram where you only know about 40% of the words. It takes incredible intuition.
But they start piecing it together.
They did. They saw the number for Mexico. They saw the number for Alliance. They saw Japan.
Japan. That's a twist we haven't even mentioned yet.
Yeah. Zimmerman also wanted Mexico to mediate between Germany and Japan to get Japan to switch sides.
He had a whole global vision going on.
He really did. But the code breakers in Room 40, specifically Nigel de Grey and William Montgomery, they started filling in the blanks. And when they decoded the phrase lost territory, the whole picture became terrifyingly clear.
Let's talk about that offer. Because this is the part that, when it finally hit the American papers, made people's heads explode.
Unbelievable audacity.
Zimmerman wasn't just asking for a treaty. He was actively carving up the map of North America.
He was offering the quote-unquote restoration of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico.
Offering 3 entire U.S. states to a foreign power. But here's the question I always have when I read about this. Was this ever a realistic threat? Like, did Mexico even seriously consider doing it?
That's a really great question, and it often gets overlooked in the drama of the story. You have to look at the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico in 1917.
It was awful, right?
It was terrible.
Because of Pancho Villa.
Exactly. Pancho Villa had raided Columbus, New Mexico in 1916. And in response, President Wilson sent General Pershing with thousands of troops straight into Mexico on this punitive expedition.
Right, so there were already American troops on Mexican soil.
Exactly. Tensions were incredibly high.
So when Zimmerman looks at the map, he doesn't see a happy, peaceful neighbor. He sees a potential enemy of the United States just waiting for an excuse.
He saw a massive opportunity. However, the president of Mexico at the time, Venustiano Carranza, wasn't a fool.
He knew better.
Well, he actually commissioned a military commission to study the German proposal.
Really? So he took it seriously?
He took it seriously enough to do the math, but the math said absolutely not.
What were the main issues?
Well, first, Germany couldn't actually supply the arms and gold they promised. The British blockade completely stopped that.
Right. They can't even feed themselves, let alone supply a foreign army.
Exactly. Second, Mexico was right in the middle of its own civil war. They didn't have the stability for a foreign invasion.
Makes sense.
And third, Even if they somehow managed to take back Texas, the U.S. population living there was so heavily armed and patriotic that an endless insurgency was completely guaranteed.
It would be a nightmare to hold.
Carranza realized it would essentially be national suicide.
So the threat wasn't necessarily a military one, like Mexico wasn't going to invade next Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
But the political threat of the offer itself was massive.
The intent was the weapon. The fact that Germany was trying to orchestrate this was the issue.
Let's go back to room 40. Nigel de Grey has this decoded message in his hands. He knows it's absolute dynamite. He rushes it to Admiral Hall. And here is where the story turns into a full-blown spy thriller.
It really does.
Because they don't call the White House immediately, do they? They just sit on it.
They sit on it for weeks. This is the classic intelligence dilemma. If Britain just handed the telegram to Washington right then and said, hey, look what we found, the Germans would instantly know their codes were broken.
Right, because how else would the British have gotten a message sent on American cables?
Exactly. And then Germany changes the codes and room 40 goes completely dark.
They would lose their eyes on the German fleet right when submarine warfare is ramping up.
Which they couldn't afford. So Admiral Hall had to construct a cover story. He had to figure out a way to pretend they got the telegram without admitting they intercepted it on the transatlantic cable.
How did they manage to pull that off?
Well, they knew the message had been forwarded from Washington down to Mexico City on commercial telegraph lines. So they claimed their British intelligence agent in Mexico City had simply bribed a telegraph office employee to steal a physical copy of the deciphered message after it arrived.
That is brilliant. It completely shifts the leak from the secure transatlantic cable to just some corrupt clerk in Mexico.
It perfectly protected their source. But it took them until late February to line all those pieces up.
So they wait.
They wait. Finally, on February 24th, they handed the complete transcript to the American ambassador in London, Walter Hines Page.
And Page sends it straight to Wilson. Now, we established earlier that Wilson was a peace candidate. He was holding out hope. What happens in the Oval Office when he reads this thing?
The scales just fall from his eyes.
Oh.
You have to understand Wilson's mindset. He viewed himself as a moral leader. He thought he could reason with Germany diplomatically.
Right.
This telegram proved that while he was drafting peace notes, Germany was actively plotting to dismember his country. It was a personal betrayal just as much as a national one.
So on March 1st, 1917, they release it to the press. The Associated Press runs it everywhere. And the reaction is pretty complicated at first, isn't it?
It was very complicated. Initially, there was this massive wave of disbelief. You have to remember, anti-British sentiment was actually pretty high in parts of the U.S. at the time.
Really?
Yes, especially among Irish Americans and German Americans. Many people thought it was a British forgery.
Just a fake news story planted to drag the U.S. into the trenches.
Exactly. And it does sound like bad fiction, right? That
Yeah.
Kaiser wants to give Texas to Mexico. I can completely see why people were skeptical.
I would be skeptical, too. But this is where Arthur Zimmerman makes what has to be the strangest move of his entire career, the one that totally sealed Germany's fate.
He confessed.
He confessed.
It's baffling. On March 3rd, a reporter asked him directly about the telegram, and he simply said, "I cannot deny it. It is true."
Why? Why on earth would he do that? He could have just denied it until the end of time. There was no absolute proof the public could see.
Historians still debate this constantly. Some think he was just this honest, rigid bureaucrat who literally didn't know how to lie effectively to the press.
Okay, that's one theory.
Others think he genuinely believed the American people would actually understand.
Understand.
Yeah, that they would see it as a reasonable defensive measure, since the U.S. was likely joining the Allies anyway due to the submarine warfare. He thought they'd respect the strategy.
That is a staggering misreading of the room.
It was totally fatal. Once he admitted it, the debate in the U.S. just ended overnight. The forgery theories vanished. Now, it was undeniably real.
And it changes everything.
Completely. The isolationists in the Midwest, who honestly didn't care about submarines sinking ships in the Atlantic, suddenly cared very, very much about a foreign invasion coming from the South.
It totally united the country.
It made the war defensive for America. It wasn't about saving Europe anymore. It was about defending Arizona.
And the timeline just rapidly accelerates from there. April 2nd, Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war. April 6th, the U.S. is officially in.
And that is the ballgame. The German gamble failed spectacularly. The submarine warfare did hurt Britain, but it didn't starve them out in time.
Not even close.
And instead of a distracted America, Germany now faced an angry, united, fresh industrial superpower.
It's the ultimate unintended consequence. Zimmerman tried to keep the U.S. out by threatening them, and instead, he practically pulled them in by the collar.
Iorio's article highlights this irony perfectly. If Zimmerman had just kept his mouth shut, or if he hadn't sent the telegram at all, it's highly possible the U.S. enters the war much later, or with way less public enthusiasm.
Right, a divided America might not have mobilized nearly as quickly.
Exactly.
It's honestly terrifying to think about the what-ifs. Like, if that cable hadn't been intercepted.
Let's play that out for a second. If Room 40 misses that specific cable, and remember, they were intercepting thousands of messages, the U.S. might still have entered the war eventually due to the ship sinkings.
Right.
But without the smoking gun of the invasion plot, Wilson faces a deeply divided Congress. Maybe the U.S. only provides naval support. Maybe American troops don't arrive in France in 1918 in those massive numbers.
And in 1918, the Germans launched their spring offensive.
Yeah.
They almost broke the Allied lines.
They were incredibly close to breaking through. If the American reinforcements hadn't been there to plug the gaps, Germany might have forced a negotiated peace.
Wow.
We could literally be living in a world where the German Empire survived the 20th century.
All hinging on a few code breakers in a damp room in London and a diplomat who got way too creative with his DMs.
It really underscored the fragility of history. We look back today and see the Allied victory as completely inevitable, but in early 1917, it was anything but inevitable.
It also brings up a really interesting point about technology. We started this deep dive by joking about DMs, but the telegraph was the internet of its day.
It was.
And just like today, people simply assumed their encryption was safe.
That hubris is a constant in history. Zimmerman fully believed his code was unbreakable, and he believed the Americans were too naive to catch on.
He underestimated everyone.
He totally underestimated the friction of technology, the physical cables, the human element in the telegraph offices, the persistence of enemy intelligence.
It's a huge lesson for the modern era, too. Just because you have a secure line doesn't mean someone isn't listening.
Or that you won't accidentally hit reply all and copy the British Empire.
Exactly. Before we wrap up, I do want to circle back to the Mexican angle one last time. Because it strikes me that Germany treated Mexico as just a pawn on a chessboard, completely ignoring the actual reality of the people living there.
It's a textbook example of the colonial mindset. Berlin looked at a map and just saw territories to be traded.
Right. Just colors on a map.
They didn't understand the local politics, the military capabilities, or the desires of the Mexican government. They projected their own desperate strategic needs onto a neighbor that wanted absolutely nothing to do with a world war.
And in doing so, they handed their enemies the greatest propaganda weapon of the entire war.
A weapon they forged themselves, signed by their own foreign secretary, and delivered via their enemy's communication lines.
When you put it that way, it really is a comedy of errors.
Yeah.
Just with millions of lives at stake.
A tragedy of errors, perhaps.
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive into the Zimmerman telegram. From the cut cables in the Atlantic to the brilliant code breakers in Room 40 to the explosive headlines in the New York Times.
It's a story that absolutely reminds us that words have consequences. And sometimes those consequences are global.
And it leaves you with a final thought to really mull over. We live in an age of instant communication. Encryption is everywhere. But the human element, the decision to send that risky message, the assumption that you're smarter than the person listening in, that hasn't changed one bit since 1917.
Not a bit. The tools change, but the psychology remains exactly the same.
If Room 40 hadn't cracked code 13040, the map of North America and the history of Europe might look very, very different today. It's definitely a sobering thought.
It certainly keeps you up at night.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you next time.